Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kyrstin Mallon. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to revisit one aspect of my research, especially given our current health crisis and all the kinds of questions about borders and boundaries that it has surfaced. Looking at this material in hindsight is eerily futuristic in terms of both these local and global responses that we're seeing to the COVID-19 pandemic. I'll talk a bit about this ethnographic work, but in the end, I want to invite some kind of broader thoughts about both our current questions of health governance and the value of medical anthropology in these kinds of moments. This presentation is titled Sinks for the Press, Health and Boundary Governance on the Dominican Border. So following this devastating 2010 earthquake that we all heard about in Haiti, reports of cholera in the country surfaced in October. So in response to this nearby presence of an acute and often deadly disease, the Dominican Republic deployed 1,500 soldiers alongside hundreds of public health professionals to the border between the two countries. In the words of the head of Dominican Armed Forces, this military action was meant to definitively seal the border. The idea was to make it impossible for Haitians to cross into the Dominican Republic. So Dajabon, which is the northernmost border town, media attention centered on public health infrastructure that appeared in the national line and on the binational marketplace where Haitians and Dominicans regularly interacted to buy and sell goods. One of the key factors of this attention was on the row of mobile sinks set up along the border gate, where Haitians crossing into the Dominican Republic were required to wash their hands in a bleach water concoction. Another factor was the binational marketplace, which was drastically refigured and relocated as a response in part to this particular epidemic. So as I conducted field research at the border 2 years after the outbreak, I expected to find accounts of the disease fresh in the memory of border residents. The hand washing stations and the remodeled marketplace were still there after all. To my surprise, firsthand accounts of cholera were really hard to come by. I pointed to the hand washing stations and the market, asking, didn't this infrastructure reflect the prevalence of the disease? As one border resident explained, there was never much cholera up here. They put the sinks there for the press. So according to this man and others, the sinks and this kind of emergency infrastructure reflected not necessarily the prevalence of cholera in this region, but the spectacle of health surveillance. So if this is the case, what I want us to be thinking about in this presentation is, what do public health policies at the border actually regulate? Nations, of course, often serve as units of analysis in times of epidemics. The maps produced by health organizations, NGOs, and nation states themselves draw these hard and fast borders through the trajectory of diseases. Yet, as we are all acutely aware, and in this moment especially, disease itself rarely follows the rules of immigration. So let me just say a few words about cholera as an illness. Cholera, of course, is spread through food and water infected with the bacteria, and this usually happens through feces. It is often associated with poverty and a lack of infrastructure, but despite this association, poverty and cholera are not mutually exclusive. The disease is magnified, not caused, by a lack of infrastructure. So when news of the cholera outbreak in Haiti reached international audiences, many people assumed that this was just a part of the fallout of a major earthquake in a poor country with bad infrastructure. In reality, cholera was not ever a presence in Haiti until 2010. The disease was brought to the island by the United Nations peacekeeping mission, also known as MINUSTA, whose soldiers had been exposed to it in Nepal and who introduced it into Haiti's Central River through a UN base whose sewage line ran straight into an extremely important watershed. So within a few weeks of this original outbreak, cholera had reached the Haitian capital. So from the Dominican Republic, military troops and public health officials were sent to the border to act as this kind of cordón sanitario or sanitary barrier, meant to block both migration and incoming trade from Haiti. So this attention, of course, was directed, as I'll talk a little bit, on this northernmost border town, which included the biggest binational marketplace. Now, Dominican authorities eventually allowed migration patterns to resume, but these new health and security precautions made sanitation a part of the process of crossing the border. These sanitary rituals, really importantly, remained extremely visible. Dominican media sources worried over the health implications of so many people crossing the border from a cholera-infected nation, and Dominican health authorities set up these mobile sinks at the border where Haitian market vendors were required to wash their hands, as I mentioned before. I arrived in Dajabon in 2012 to research the lasting impacts of the cholera epidemic. Many people in this border town urged me to go early to the border gate on market days to see this spectacle that everyone talked about. It's crazy, one person told me. As soon as the gates open, everyone starts running towards the market. So after several failed attempts to witness the spectacle, I finally arrived at the gates before they opened. These layers of migration and military checkpoints protect the large metal gate running across the border bridge, and a line of waist-high portable metal fences stop vehicles and large wheelbarrows Haitian vendors use. One side of the border, the one that is closest in this picture, is guarded by the Dominican Border Security Force, or CESFRON, but the other side, as you can see, and the blue wall on the other side of the bridge is guarded by the UN. So I watched a long line of people carrying heavy loads along the Haitian banks of the river, getting ready to cross. And from the Dominican side, 3 men struggled with a huge hose in the middle of the bridge. The hose was leaking water onto the dusty road where it looked as though hundreds of people would soon pass through. Eventually, the men situated the hose in the middle of the bridge, which just created more puddles. While people continued to line up in anticipation of the gates opening, a migration official walked around the puddles of water that had collected with a gallon of Clorox bleach, dumping it into the standing water and kind of dumping it over a few equally soggy woven mats that lined the sidewalk next to the railings. So as the bridge gates opened, market goers jogged towards their stalls, wading through these bleached puddles as they crossed the national line. So in addition to the sanitized puddles that Haitian market goers passed through to get to the marketplace, and the sinks that I mentioned before, vehicles coming from Haiti had to stop at the Dominican migration checkpoint, and their tires were sprayed down with bleach as well. These practices are important not only for their public health implications, but also as these rituals of sanitation. Border guards become these guards of sanitary citizenship, and Haitians crossing into the Dominican Republic become a potential threat to the nation state. Leo Chavez has pointed to the way that border surveillance at times acts as a spectacle meant to denote difference between citizens and others. So in this case, the identity of the other hinges on assumptions about health that are mapped onto historically situated ideas about race in relation to Haiti. Dominican state practices of regulation create these oppositional identities where the state identifies non-nationals and racial others as lacking these modern hygienic subjectivities. So people insisted that I witnessed the flood of people coming across the border on market days, but it was these bleach flooded bridges acting as sanitary checkpoints that gave meaning to the event, reifying this criteria of Dominicanness and constructing Haitians as a group in need of sanitary intervention. So while Haitians were allowed to enter the Dominican Republic, they were also singled out in this publicly visible performance as possible pollutants. So now I want to shift a little bit to talk about the infrastructure of public health responses at the border. A 2-story warehouse structure casts a really big shadow over the official bridge connecting Haiti to the Dominican Republic. It's bordered by the Massacre River and enclosed by a tall fence with 2 entrances. So there's one entrance for Dominicans and one entrance for Haitians. Bi-weekly international markets are a mainstay and a long-standing tradition of most border towns. So I was sitting in the office of a local NGO a few blocks from the border, and one of the employees turned on the radio, which was featuring a talk show in discussing the new market hall in Dajabon. So I recognized the voice on air, and I kind of turned around and I saw that it was Juan Carlos, the director of the Immigration Rights Division of the NGO, who had called into the radio show to give his 2 cents on this situation. He tried to redirect the host's empty complaints about the structural faults of the market and reminded listeners that this particular NGO had completed a study in 2007 when the market was originally proposed. Their study warned that plans for the new market only allowed space for 2/3 of the vendors known to participate regularly in this trading event. He argued that this advice had been ignored, and because of this lack of attention, violations of human rights were a common occurrence in the new market. So linking the layout of space to violations of citizenship and human rights, Juan Carlos argued that the design was more than bad planning. Given the extent to which the regulation of space has changed after the cholera outbreak, this selective planning for the market hall suggests that the layout of the market had less to do with facility or safety than it did with increased control over people and space. It's important to note that these binational markets have often come under media scrutiny for the anarchic fashion in which they operate, the lack of hygiene, and the lack of regulation. So vendors, border residents, and public officials might agree that the conditions of the market before the outbreak were less than optimal, but the Dominican press in particular highlighted the market as chaotic, unhygienic, and uncontrollable. Now, there's a really long history of state discourses that paint Haitian migrants as unsanitary and unhealthy. And much of the discourse leading up to the construction of the new market hall reflected these long-standing anxieties about purity and filth, where media narratives depicted the space as disruptive or dangerous, and therefore characteristically Haitian. So this is kind of what it looks like. The post-market hall in the outskirts of Dajabon moved from this location to this location. Now, the market hall had been held in the porous space and previous to 2010, and the new location really restricted the movement, mostly of Haitian market participants. So it channeled them through the border bridge directly and into the fenced space of the market, where there were only 2 entrances and exits. So by increasing the regulation and only allowing people to cross between certain hours on market days, the enclosure of the market space and its military surveillance made sure that Haitian migrants, Haitian market vendors could not set up their wares in advance and couldn't set up in the space of the market like they had before. Dominicans, on the other hand, often arrived to the market early in the morning and started selling their wares whenever someone showed up to buy. I'll briefly say that this system tends to favor Dominican men who sell in bulk, and they have sufficient money to rent the spaces. Haitian women, on the other hand, who made up the majority of Haitian market vendors, had to wait for the gates to open, pass their goods through customs, and then they often had to walk around the market space selling whatever they were able to carry. These are some of the changes to the market spaces. As you can see here, there's clearly delineated selling spaces, and there are clearly delineated sinks for washing hands. Here in this picture, the faucets have been taken off. Considering these associations that the Dominican media gives to disorder as originating in Haiti and from Haitians, these organizational changes to the marketplace can be understood as a Dominicanization of this space of the economy in the name of a public health crisis. The separation of the market from the rest of town, the partitioning of space within the market hall, and the distinct offices for administration, as well as the bathrooms and sinks, despite the fact that there was rarely running water, were meant to actually remind participants of correct hygienic processes that reflect a distinctly Dominican, modern, developed articulation of appropriate economic activity. These changes, which were jumped onto the marketplace in a time of a public health crisis, brought the economic activity of the market also under the surveillance of the Dominican state, who now accounts for many of the profits made within the space, and it leaves informal participation at a distinct disadvantage. So these two examples are meant to show a little bit of how the Dominican state intervenes and what it sees as the problem of borderlands and the problem of public health crises, where they're faced with this problem of bacterial gatekeeping. So how to keep out the unseeable, how to separate bacterial bodies from human bodies and bodies of water, which are the ones that carry these bacteria. Part of the Dominican state's tactics here have been to tack the unseeable to the seeable, to Haitian bodies. So borderland programs of sanitation worked as ways of solidifying the divisions between self and other. The kinds of dangerous entanglements that public health interventions have targeted are both entanglements of human identities, as well as they are of these ecological dependencies. To end, I want to kind of draw our attention to the body of water below the bridge, upon which public health officials created the Clorox bleach puddles. So the very landmark, the river that articulates the border, is also the medium through which diseases like cholera flow. Water indicates this division between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but it also signals historical entanglements, the dual dependencies on the river as a resource. And as we are often aware, water both conducts and contains. So public health policies like these bleach puddles bleed into the river, just as bacteria from these international aid campaigns also finds its way into binational, international watersheds. When we're looking at these kind of instances of public health governance, and especially in these times of crisis, I want to pose the kind of more open question of health security for whom? For whom are we making these practices? Who is benefiting from keeping certain people out on the basis of these public health campaigns? And then what are the longer standing consequences for these kinds of restrictions that tie disease into border making policies? I will end there, and I look forward to fielding questions and discussion with the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.